Welcome to another episode of Angels, Positivity, and Love. I'm your host, Michael Andre Ford in Texas. We've got incredible guests from all over the world, all walks of life. Backgrounds could be, actors in Australia, for example, New York Times bestsellers, Amazon bestsellers, I should probably say today, professors, doctors, psychiatrists, amazing experiences as well, and career trajectories, oftentimes a lot of personal experiences that have built a big foundation that allow the person to either inspire others or literally directly help others on their life path. Today, we've got somebody who's super inspiring in what they do. It's the universe, cosmos, the search for extraterrestrial life out there. Are we alone? And this is Seth Shostak, our senior astronomer from SETI, the SETI Institute. We're going to let him cover some of the basics about SETI, and Seth has a tremendous resume, tremendous background. We're going to get to that in just 1 second, but I just want to welcome Seth on the show. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Michael.
Well, it's great to meet you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. You have one of those pedigrees where I can only barely scratch the surface. I'll do the best I can. PhD, astrophysics, Caltech, at least 60 research papers, if not more, 50 articles, 300 popular, like in societal art, societal publications out there. Books, you've been a keynote speaker, probably hundreds of times, at least 50 to 200 times. You're in demand. You're going to be on a cruise. I think it's on the West Coast to Alaska, June, July, August sometime. And that's going to be well attended as well, with a focus, I think, on, again, are we alone in the universe? Can you take us through where this started, your desire to be in sort of the field of science, and then later how you got your fascination with the universe, the cosmos, and so on?
Well, Michael, it's probably not a very special story. It all began in childhood, as these stories always do. And I was interested in astronomy as a kid. I used to go to New York to see relatives, and the Hayden Planetarium, as it was called then, was in Manhattan, 84th Street. And my aunt would always give me subway fare so I could go to the planetarium. So I developed an interest in astronomy. And one of the big questions back then, and still is there anybody out there? And they would regularly have programs on that. And after that, it was the usual academic track. But that's how it began.
Beautiful. And I've been to the Hayden Planetarium. I was in New York City for 19 years. Love that place. Can you share with us, growing up, were there any programs or movies, and there were only gajillions of them? Remember the old Star Trek series in the 60s, late 60s, Forbidden Planet and everything else. Did you get influenced by television, any of the programming there?
No, absolutely. And I watched all those shows. And in particular, I would go to the movies every weekend with a buddy of mine. This was from age 9 or 10 on. And my favorites were indeed the cheesy sci-fi films that were being made in those days. They may have been cheesy, but for a young kid, they weren't so obviously cheesy. So that stimulated my interest. Then, of course, television began doing some of that stuff, and Star Trek was one of the early attempts. And I became a fan of the original Star Trek series. After that, I didn't follow it so much. I had other things I was doing, but the original series. I mean, it wasn't really so much about space. It was just a space opera, if you will. It was just the kind of story you would see on a channel showing cowboy movies. I mean, it was very interesting for me.
Well, if we took sort of that motif from the original Star Trek series, man's journey both out in the stars, but I'd argue a lot of that was about the journey within. Can you talk to us about what you see as the eternal questions for man here that have been floating around forever that sort of segue into the SETI Institute to your own studies?
Well, I think they're fairly obvious. I mean, it's the question of, is there anybody out there? I mean, you look up at the sky, and of course, I think anybody who's done that would have asked at some point, is there anybody up there looking back this way? And that idea, I mean, that's not a new idea. That idea goes back at least thousands of years. And, these days, the difference is not only can we ask that question, but there's some possibility, at least, we could answer it. And I can hardly imagine any news story that would be more interesting than to have discovered that there's somebody out there.
Now, if you don't mind, Can you explain what SETI is? Spell it out. I'll say search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but can you go ahead and give us the quick, 30-second minute lowdown on what SETI is, how long it's been in existence? I think 1984, 85. I'm blanking on the names. Tom Pearson and Jill Tarter having gotten that started, yes?
Well, they set up an organization. The idea of SETI, which is, as you say, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. I mean, that's a very old idea. Again, could we get in touch? And of course, if you went back 100 years, people figured, yeah, there are undoubtedly aliens out there, and they're probably as close as Mars. So there were efforts to see if they could to see if anyone could find any evidence for alien presence on Mars. And of course, they found it, or at least they thought they did. I mean, the canals on Mars, which were very popular around 1900, were a big deal because the idea was being promulgated by an astronomer from Harvard, Percival Lowell, and he had a 9-inch telescope. It wasn't very huge, but he claimed he could see these straight lines crisscrossing the surface of Mars, which he assumed were canals. Canals were big back then. And that really started the whole idea that, not only were the aliens out there, but we could find evidence that they were out there, that they weren't, just lost amongst the star fields of the universe.
Can you talk to us about the modalities or the methodology that SETI is using? And since the 80s, has it changed at all? Do you periodically try to contemplate new ways to get your answers?
Well, I mean, you're trying to find evidence that they're out there. And the modern approach to that, beginning in 1960, 61, actually, was to try and pick up signals on, using very sensitive radio equipment that would show that, there's somebody out there with the technical expertise to build big transmitters. And they're either broadcasting signals into space because they're just, sort of doing a reconnaissance and want to know if anybody will respond to them, or they have multiple colonies, if you will, maybe in their own solar system, conceivably in other people's solar system. And this is just communication. So that would prove right away that, you have some cosmic company. And that idea, as I say, goes back to 1960, 61, when Frank Drake, an astronomer who at that time was working for an organization called the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, did this first experiment to try and find them by pointing an antenna at the sky at some nearby star systems, hoping to pick up a signal.
Okay, now for SETI and for your own personal opinions, do they diverge at all, or are they pretty much in lockstep and sync? There's 100 employees there. I'm sure you can't all be in agreement on every single point. How does it usually work? You guys are all rowing, though, in the same direction, generally speaking, yes?
Well, I think that there's a misunderstanding because yes, the SETI Institute may have 100 employees, but most of them are doing astrobiology. They're not trying to listen for aliens. Okay. That experiment is done by a very, very small number, fewer than a handful. So that's mostly a money thing. But, to say that they're in lockstep, they're not in lockstep with anything. They're just doing the experiment.
Okay. And the Carl Sagan Center, can you talk about that?
Well, Carl Sagan Center just refers to those employees who are basically doing astrobiology. So they're interested in life in space, but, that might mean microbes on Mars, right?
Yeah.
So, just finding some biology elsewhere would be very interesting because it would tell you that biology is not a very rare thing. It's not some sort of miracle, if you will, that it's, all over the place. We haven't yet found any, but the expectation is that eventually we will.
Okay. And in terms of the UAP, UFO, I don't know how to say it. This entire field of inquiry has heated up in at least the last, I'll say, 2 to 5 years, especially on social media with the Pentagon disclosure efforts, this and that. It's, the thinking man's game here because everyone's saying, where's the proof? What's this? It's like watching, literally, it's like a little bit of a chess match. There's a lot of moves going on. You've got a lot of participants, whether it's corporate America, certain aspects, defense contractors, Pentagon, Congress, you name it, scientific community. What's your take on all that? Are we still just nowhere near any evidence whatsoever? What's the way you handle that entire field of inquiry?
Yeah, I think like most scientists, we don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about UAPs, UFOs, and so forth. We've never seen any science in it. It's a very widespread belief. Something like 60 or 70% of the American public thinks that Earth is being visited by aliens and that the government is covering that up. I would submit to you that it would be remarkable if the government could cover that up. I don't know how they could. There are 800 satellites or some number approximately like that are orbiting the Earth, photographing the Earth, and they would see these things, of course. And they're not all Americans, and they're not all under American satellites, and they're certainly not all under the control of the governments or the military or anything like that. It would be very obvious if we were being visited, but we don't have that evidence. Not in science. No, it's in the popular media, of course. People like that idea, but it's unfortunately not something you can prove.
Right. And that also kind of answers maybe the next question, which is, have you had any personal experiences, childhood, teens, young adult, last week, camping out and about, where you would have questioned what you saw, but absolutely no way to confirm anything?
Oh, well, that happens all the time. I mean, you just see something in the sky and you might not know what it is, but the big logical mistake that most people make is to say, well, it's obviously aliens visiting our planet. I mean, just because you see something that you don't understand doesn't mean it's aliens, but people do jump to that conclusion essentially always.
Sure. And then can we switch this a little? There's not just the external, that it needs to be on some distant planet or some star system, and it's I'm not sure how to quite say this, but signals. Can you talk about the other areas that SETI's at least considered, you've considered? There's a big phrase going around, and this isn't just like this year or last year, but interdimensionality. And again, this is going beyond my bailiwick, but how do you handle the whole concept of life? I've got a phrase for you. Non-corporeal, energy-based life forms, but I'll also add non-corporeal, energy-based life forms that can show up as full humans. You pinch them, they pinch you, just beyond physical form if they wish. How do you handle that topic from a scientific perspective? Is it on the menu at all for SETI, or are you strictly sticking to, if you can't see it through, and again, forgive me for not understanding the right lingo, radio telemetry, telescopes, and so on, then is that the focus only for SETI, or is it also somehow finding a way to try to tackle the interdimensionality aspect of everything?
Yeah, well, I don't know what that means. It is tossed around a lot by the, if you will, woo-woo science. But interdimensionality, what does that mean? Tell me what it is. How do you do an experiment to prove that there's such a thing as interdimensionality? It sounds to me personally like an attempt to, put scientific trappings in terms of the vocabulary on a subject which doesn't seem to have much observational evidence. So we don't spend any time on it. I can tell you that.
Okay, and so it definitely has to be the following way. For it to be a fact, or for it to be in existence, it has to be proven. It has to be done through thinking and science, and I'm probably skipping, and logic and reason.
Experiments.
Yeah, experiments. Okay. And that, you just led me to my next question. Do you ever, as an organization, does Bill Diamond or anybody call, and I'm going to try to do a reference from the Hunt for Red October, if anybody remembers the late 80s submarine movie, A Crazy Ivan. It's a sudden 180 to see if you're being tailed by an enemy submarine because there's a quiet zone behind the sub. Do you guys ever do a full stop, a retreat, anything once every 5 years, decade, or every twice a year to sit down and just start over for the search for extraterrestrial life? Pretend it was more about inventing that type of engine that doesn't exist, that the auto industry wants to be able to invent. There's been plenty of examples where a bunch of engineers or scientists get together and they just try to brainstorm another approach to the question. Are they approaching, the question perhaps not only the right way, but in potentially other ways that could get them their answers? Do you guys ever go back to sort of fundamentals and ask, is there another way to do this?
Well, I think that that's just the nature of science, right? The individual scientist will decide, look, we've just learned this about the universe, maybe the prevalence of planets or something like that. And, that can suggest a new way of addressing the problem if there's anybody out there. So that happens all the time. That's just, as I say, the nature of science. It's not, programmatic. It's not that there's one way to do things and we just keep doing that one way until somebody says, well, maybe we ought to do it another way. I mean, people do the experiments that they think are most likely to provide them with something useful, something interesting. But that, as I say, that's just science.
Okay. Can you talk to us about METI and the affiliation there? Is there any affiliation? And can you explain what METI is? I know it's very similar to SETI, but I don't think most in the audience wouldn't understand the difference.
Well, the difference is very simple. SETI is, you're using telescopes, usually radio telescopes, to try and pick up a signal that somebody is broadcasting for whatever reason, and that would prove that they're out there. That somebody's out there who's clever enough to build a radio transmitter. But another possibility, and it's mostly due to a fellow by the name of Doug Vakoch, who happened to be in the office next to mine for many, many years. Doug Vakoch thinks that, well, maybe you're not going to pick up the signal because they don't even know that you're here. So why not broadcast an invitation, as it were, to get in touch? So that's called messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, METI. And there's been some effort there, but very little. To begin with, there aren't very many transmitters that are on big antennas that could, in fact, be used to signal anybody out there. But the real problem is you don't know where to aim those antennas, even if you decide you want to do that experiment. Now, a second consideration is that we're doing that anyhow. We're broadcasting to the sky all the time, mostly radar. The radars we have, which are mostly intended to, be useful for aircraft and stuff like that, but also defense. You have big radars that are used to look for incoming missiles. That's a sort of a relic of the Cold War. But those signals go out deep into space. So we've been announcing the fact that Homo sapiens is here, at least since the Second World War. So maybe you could consider that messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, but there's no specific message on those signals. They're just signals that would tell somebody, hey, those guys can build big transmitters.
Are there any theories out there from other scientists elsewhere around the globe that you've at least appreciated, but you certainly don't agree with because it's not enough proof, evidence, science, evidence-based, thinking and stuff like that? Are there any scientists out there, though, that you do admire that you might still disagree with when it comes to life, either around us, within us, out there? Is there anybody that you admire and keep an eye on?
Well, I mean, obviously, you have your opinion about the various scientists, right? And you judge them on the basis of their ideas and their experiments. But again, that's just science. That's not specific to this field, right? And of course, there's also the public, which has sometimes slightly bonkers ideas about all this. But it just that's unavoidable. That's always been the case.
And this is going to be more on the philosophical front, whether, there's been many, many religions, cultures, philosophies, self-help, woo-woo-woo, new age, and everything else. But a lot of these groups do try to describe what is here versus what's up here. And by up here, I just mean thinking, judging, knowing that precludes possibility. It's concrete knowing. It's what science is based on, because you got to know, but, often you might only have to wait 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 years. And whatever you knew one moment, it gets knocked out of the way by the next scientific discovery, and we know a whole new thing. Do you have a way that you like to approach mankind's search for knowledge? I mean, I think it ties into all the world philosophies or the philosophers of the past. Think of Einstein. I'm not sure how you regard Einstein, but there's many people who believe he was super connected with respect to how he went about getting his ideas and so on. Is there a way you handle that, or is it strictly science is science, black and white?
Well, science is science being black and white. I'm not sure what that means, but science is something where you have an idea and can you demonstrate it with an experiment? Otherwise, you're just sitting around a bar talking to people, which is okay, but it isn't science, right? So the scientific method isn't very secretive, or there's nothing magical about it. It's just can cook up an experiment that could either prove or usually disprove your idea, and that's how it's done, and that's the way the scientists who are involved in the search for life elsewhere, that's how they proceed. I mean, it's not sort of seat of the pants or mystic or anything like that. It's just, what can you do to maybe find metabolism, biology somewhere else? It's like atomic physics. It's not metaphysical.
If one of the world's wealthiest, I'll just say billionaires at this point, offered $1 billion, but you're not allowed to do science the way you've done it to date, you have to find a new modality. You're funded, and you can hire 100 grad students or however it works, PhDs to work for you. I'm going to give you a NASA astronaut quote from Story Musgrave that I love. Getting out of the comfortable path, that's what exploration is all about. Combining the two, $1 billion check just to you. SETI is popping champagne corks and everything else. Do you have a way you could spend those dollars? And if it needs to be smaller, is there any other field of exploration that you wouldn't mind taking a look at, or is what you're doing now everything we need to know for?
You certainly have to be open-minded. I mean, whatever you think is the best approach today is probably not going to look that way 10 years from now. That's because of developments in the science. You know more about things like the prevalence of planets or something like that. And of course, the technology. That's a thing that moves very, very quickly. Do you have better equipment now for doing an experiment to prove whatever it is you're trying to prove? So again, that's just science, right? That's the way science works. It's always, looking at what's the state of the art in terms of what we know about how the universe works, and also what kind of experiments we can do based on the changing technology, which of course, technology is always changing.
Sure. Okay. Since the 80s, have you gotten close? Everybody got excited, but it ended up being false data. Can you share with us that 1, 2, a dozen times, not all dozen, but those moments where you got excited, maybe you couldn't sleep at night, you were like rushing back to the office, you needed to see the data. Were there a few of those moments?
Well, to begin with, there's no such thing as getting close. What does that mean? Right? It's like, discovering the Americas. Have you done it yet? No. Are you close? How do you know? You don't know. So it's not a matter of getting close, but you do have false alarms where you think that you may have found something. And that has happened in SETI, where we picked up signals and we thought, well, maybe this is it. But those signals have always turned out to be, yes, from an intelligent species, but from humans, right? Because there are just an enormous number of transmitters on Earth that produce signals of the type that we're looking for. And consequently, every now and then you pick up one and you get excited. And that certainly happened. I remember one evening back in, I think it was 1997. I don't remember exactly, but where, the boss was sending around emails and so forth. And it looked like we'd pick up a signal, which we had, but it turned out to be terrestrial interference. That's a difficulty with this kind of experiment where you're trying to eavesdrop on the aliens, is that there are lots and lots of signals, and they're produced by humans, and you have to sort those all out.
And one last on the UAP UFO front, there's a lot of, I don't know how to say this again, a lot of reports, videotape and other stuff, radar screens and things like that captured from either naval exercises, fighter pilots reporting what they've seen, and so on. Can you encapsulate how you view that? Again, firsthand accounts, radar and other, this is coming from the US military and so on, and from elsewhere around the globe. How do you handle all that? Is it not in the same bailiwick as the way SETI is operating? And can you give us, your usual response for that?
Well, look, as I say, 60% of the American public thinks that we are being visited and that the government is somehow covering that up. But consider, is that even a reasonable thing to say, given the fact that you've got, as I say, nearly 1,000 satellites from all countries, or many countries anyhow, that are doing reconnaissance of what's in our skies, if you will. They're just mapping the Earth, but they would see anything that was, bigger than I don't know, SUV in orbit around the Earth. So you would know about anything that was in our airspace. And the public loves to believe that, oh, yeah, but we've got that evidence, but the government's keeping it secret. To begin with, I've worked for the government. I think I had a top secret clearance, actually. But, I was never impressed by the idea that the government could keep anything like that secret. And this in particular, you couldn't keep secret because, it is somehow that the aliens can arrange that only the US government could find them, right? It would be a phenomenon that could be observable by anybody with the right equipment. And there are many, many countries that could, in fact, in principle, find anything that was, flitting about the Earth that wasn't ours, if you will. It wasn't made by humans. And that would be a huge story, which of course, some people like to think that would be kept secret. It's never clear to me why they think it would be kept secret. The only rationale I've ever heard is that, well, the public couldn't handle the news, which is, of course, completely silly because the majority of the public thinks they're already here.
Yeah.
They're not fretting about that. But in any case, it would be a huge story. So I think that from the scientists' point of view, if there were any good evidence that we were being visited, it would occupy the days of many, many scientists for a long, long time.
And what stock do you put in firsthand accounts, even if it's done by multiple people? Is that just something that, again, if there aren't scientific instruments handy or videotape or other, it's radar, telemetry, imagery, it just doesn't count?
Well, it's not that people lie. I mean, some people, in general, people aren't lying, but witness testimony isn't very good in science. I mean, it's not useful, right? Somebody believes they've seen something, but maybe they have, maybe they haven't. You wouldn't send somebody to the electric chair based on witness testimony. Really, I don't know. Maybe you would. You shouldn't. I mean, it's no way to do science, right? Science requires some sort of measurement. So if you really think that there's something up there that's not ours, all you have to do is record it, right? Or just have lots of people look at it, that kind of thing. So witness testimony is, it's sort of fun, and it causes a lot of people to get excited, but it's, again, not so useful for science.
If we flip this intellectual pancake to the other side here, can you imagine what extraterrestrial life that, let's say, it was loving, from our perspective, way advanced and literally more knowledgeable? Can you imagine their perspective at all? Have you ever spent time trying to do that where it wouldn't happen through scientific experiments? That'll be almost the last way to go. It wouldn't be through thinking. It'd be through something in the heart. And that's what I was trying to ask about before. Can you describe, and again, a lot of philosophies, a lot of cultural, indigenous to religions to other groups, self-help to woo-woo-woo, new age, everything. How do you describe humanity, the upside of humanity, the possibility, the creativity, the I guess love, inspiration, all the fun higher vibrations here versus thinking, which you're never going to get rid of, that has to do analysis, it has to be proven. Do you have a way you describe this and this? This is only one of those eternal question things, philosophical. So, but Seth, what's the way you describe this? And also, can you see a way that it might happen here, not necessarily through science? Am I making sense with that question at all?
Well, I don't think it bears very much on science. I mean, it might be an interesting question to individuals, right? What they think, what they feel, but you're not going to discover the moons of Jupiter because of, something in your heart, right? So science is a little different. I mean, science depends on, experiment and confirmation of that experiment. It has very little to do with what's in your heart. It's what's in your head. Have you got an idea? Can you build an instrument that will show you that your idea, has some legs, that it's really something more than just a nifty feeling that you have.
Mm-hmm. And without picking anybody out, there's a lot of colleagues you've had over the years through SETI. Has anybody had a direct experience, but because it wasn't provable, they kind of had to just put it on the back burner? Any, you don't have to say who, but have you ever known anybody in the scientific field that has had direct experiences or an experience, but again, they just didn't have a video camera that day, they didn't have 50 other expert witnesses and so on? Are you just aware of someone that's had an experience?
No, that's not science. Right?
Okay.
It's not science. Science is based, in particular, this science is based on observation, right? And observation means that you've done an experiment using a telescope or whatever that can be repeated, that you can do it the next night too, and that you can have somebody over there do a similar experiment and get a similar result, right? That's science. Otherwise, it's just, I had a nifty dream. Okay, well, that's fine. But, so what, right?
Okay, last question up that particular gum tree, and then I promise no more. But if Natalie Cabral, if I said her last name correctly, yeah.
You did.
Bill Diamond, 5 days apart, each came to you and said, I had a direct experience separately. They didn't know about the other. One is in Peru, one's in Europe, and there's no communication between them. what would you do with that, or would we be back to the how we've been handling the topic? It would be like, hey, too bad we didn't have the instrumentation and everything else. And while I love you as a colleague, it's just, when we're talking, I don't know the categories or whatever, they had direct seeing, hearing, feeling, whatever. They were buying it up top and down below and convinced they had an experience. What would you do with that then? Just
Well, I would send them to their psychiatrists because
okay, perfect.
it's totally unlike them.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. Okay, last question on the entertainment Hollywood front. Are there modern movies that you've appreciated for the say this exploratory qualities? It was a Contact. I have to make it up with Matthew McConaughey and I've totally forgotten Jodie Foster.
Jodie Foster, yeah.
Yeah, did you like that? Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, I did. I was actually a consultant for the film, so
Oh,
I saw it like
I didn't
three
know.
times.
So you must have liked it a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not that I didn't have criticisms, but of course you always have criticism for any movie, and particularly one that deals with the subject of which you have, some knowledge. But, it was a movie, but they went to some trouble to try and get the science right.
Ooh.
And there's very little incentive for them to do that after all. It's not that the box office receipts are somehow going to be more favorable just because they got the science right. The audience doesn't care whether the science is right. The audience is interested in the characters and the storyline, right? So, getting it right is just something that they did because they wanted to for whatever reason. And so that film, which did get more of the science right, was different in that regard. But I go to all science fiction films. I like them all. As a kid, I used to make such films with an 8mm camera. So I do enjoy them. And the idea is not that they portray science, because usually they don't. It's that they portray some ideas, and it's about the ideas. In science fiction, at least cinema science fiction, the hero of the story is the idea. It isn't the characters. And I guess ever since I was 8 or 9 years old, I really enjoyed those kinds of films.
Okay, and I love that. You're making a great point. Think of all the movies or the TV series with not just ideas, but we'll add just a nuance to it, the possibility of what will be in the future. And we've seen it from submarines. Jules Verne is a great example. Even Star Trek with what later became, was it the Motorola, the flip phone in a way, the tricorder and everything else for technology. Is that something also you very much enjoyed over the decades?
Well, I mean, I very much enjoyed. I don't look back on my life and think, oh man, that was really, really enjoyable. But it was certainly very entertaining because it gave you at least some person's idea of what the future might be like. And I think that, at least for me, the most appealing thing about science fiction is that it might, act as a time machine to show you what could happen in the future. All right, it's not very rigorous usually, and certainly not always scientific. But I mean, it's like reading any fiction book, right? It may not be real, but it's a possibility. It's one possible scenario, either for the present or the future. So, everybody is interested in stories. I think that's hardwired into us because there's a lot of survival value in listening to stories from other humans.
And before we start to wrap it up, last little bit on the movie Contact. There was an ending, and I don't think I'm blowing it since the movie's been around for a while now. But there's, I don't know what to call it, alien life or just a non-corporeal, friendly being of light that shows up as her father. Jodie Foster probably wasn't equipped to handle seeing either light or whatever physical form they had, but just to show up in a friendly way, if you'll recall, showed up as the guy from Hill Street Blues. I've forgotten the actor's name, but showed up as a familiar face as her father to have a conversation with her. I think it was to help planet Earth back home. Was that part of the film you remember, and did you have a take on that as well, or you just thought it was part of the Hollywood, the usual?
Well, I can't say that that's what I most remember about the film. There was this idea that indeed she could see her father, but I mean, a lot of people claim that, right? They see dead relatives and so forth. But again, what science has come out of that? What experiment can you do to show that there's anything in that other than, the workings of your mind to try and hypothesize a scenario where your dead relatives come back? I mean, everybody might want to do that, or a lot of people for sure. But again, it's not science.
Hmm. Well, Seth, can you talk to us about what's coming up for the year for you? Do you have a bunch of speaking engagements or a few you'd like to mention, including that cruise? What was the name of it again?
I don't even remember the name of the cruise, but it's a cruise that goes from essentially Seattle up to Alaska. That's I think that's the only of the cruises. I have talks coming up. I have talk coming up in a couple of weeks in New Hampshire or on an island off the coast of New Hampshire. Yeah, I give a lot of talks. So yeah, but that's always happening, and people can find out about those easily enough by looking around the web.
And do you have any other books you're planning on putting out in the years ahead without, blowing the topic or anything like that?
Not a book. I tend to write articles now. I mean, you can write a book, but the problem is that the number of people who read that book is actually fewer than the number that would read an article that you might publish, maybe with Astronomy magazine or something like that. So I tend to write articles now. I've certainly written a number of articles. I just sent one in on what I think would happen if we were to find a signal, that kind of thing. Or actually, it's about what would happen if we didn't find a signal, which not many people write about.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a interesting take. Last question for SETI and for you, and any way you want to answer it. Has SETI ever sat down and set their intent to actually, like, instead of it being through science, through, again, forgive me for not getting the proper terminology, the giant telescope radio telemetry? I don't know how to say it. I've seen them in the movies. The giant machines that are white with the dishes, they've been in James Bond, everything else, Contact. Besides doing it the normal scientific way, but if there is life and it is able to communicate, it's much broader, more advanced, gentle. Let's assume loves the fabric of the universe. Otherwise, we would have all been dessert or snacks by now if there was some hostile intent. Has SETI ever sat down to state its intent from the heart to just say, hey, we'd love to make contact? Has there ever been anything you bring in a shaman or some sort of a figure if you needed a little extra help to do the requesting? Bring in Deepak Chopra, bring in Tony Robbins, bring in someone to get everybody to go kumbaya in a circle. But has SETI ever actually set its intent to want to gently reach out in an unscientific way that you know of?
Well, no, of course not, because it's not science, right? It's not science. I mean, you could have Deepak. I've talked to the guy actually, but
I got lucky. I got lucky.
I mean, he has his beliefs about things that are fundamentally not science, and so they're interesting. Doesn't mean that they're not interesting, but from a scientific perspective, what you want to do are experiments that make sense from the standpoint of science. If your hypothesis is that there's life on one of the moons of Jupiter, which is not an unreasonable hypothesis, you could bring in Deepak Chopra or something, but that isn't going to answer the question, right? As a scientist, you want to do an experiment that answers the questions.
And I'm going to give one classic quote. I unfortunately do not have the author, and this is not to go opposite of what you said, because what you said is totally valid and very important. There's a way that the world works, that science, evidence-based science, experiments, it's a must. It's how everything functions, whether it's the medical industry, this group, that group, essentially all society. But I did have a quote for you. Those who feel energy in all have never measured it. Those who try to measure it never feel it. And that could be extrapolated out back to the whole, this eternal question. And again, I think that's a fair way to put it. Eternal question of, is there life in and around us or out there? And there's certainly a lot of questions about it. Did you have a final bit you wanted to maybe leave us with in an inspirational way? Does SETI have a time limit that, let's say, you get to 2050 and if it's still doing this, haven't had the signal come in, do you have some game plan that you can mention, marketing plan? Or if, let's do it this way, if the Pentagon suddenly, or the president of the United States comes out and says alien life exists, he's forced to say it for whatever reason, culturally or militarily or anything else, is SETI going to be able to pivot and take advantage of it? Wouldn't you become overnight like the New York Yankees for one of the most popular organizations on planet? Are you even remotely prepared to handle that with all the questions coming from fifth graders, third graders, adults who are interested in science, wouldn't you become the focal point more than the Hayden Planetarium or any other organization on the globe? Wouldn't you suddenly find yourself, well, maybe NASA as well, wouldn't you find yourself being bombarded? Social media, your website crashes, you're suddenly getting 400 requests for interviews a day. Have you guys ever had that conversation on what you might have to do to revamp things?
Well, I mean, we've had practice. I mean, there have been plenty of false alarms
okay.
in the past 30 years where people think that maybe we picked up a signal, and what happens? Well, immediately the newspapers start calling you, of course. So we sort of know what would happen, and preparing for it, that may not be something you actually can do. You just have to deal with it if it arises. But, again, there's a difference between science and what people, like to believe, and,
Right.
we're going to do this on a spiritual level or something like that. I mean, they can they're perfectly permitted to do that. But as I say, from the standpoint of science, it's got to.
Sorry to interrupt, Seth, but if Lockheed Martin actually came out and said, no, we've had technology or retrieval, whatever it's called, crash retrieval bodies, whatever, would that be enough for you? That would check the box, or the Pentagon said it, or the White House, or some combination thereof, and it was official. Would that check the box, or would you still have
No, I think that's a woo-woo kind of hypothesis, right? Right.
Okay.
If that's what's called an argument from authority, right? Because it's Lockheed Martin. I mean, if that really happened, I think I'd sell my Lockheed Martin stock. I mean, because it isn't something that one organization could keep secret from the world. The idea that, for example, the federal government knows about the aliens and has, I don't know, crash debris or something hidden away in Area 51 or something like that. I mean, that makes for good, late night television, but it's not, it doesn't seem to acknowledge how science actually works. It isn't that science keeps secrets, or that Lockheed Martin keeps that kind of a secret. They may keep secrets, but only about their technology, because
it doesn't get you upset though. If it did happen, it doesn't get you upset. It would be if it happened and then it actually panned out. What would your personal reaction be? Let's give it another year. The world had to prove it. Teams of scientists went in. I'm sure you guys would be invited. Do you have that capacity, by the way, to go in if it wasn't external science exploring, the next galaxy over, 50 galaxies over and beyond? Would your Carl Sagan Center, the biologist side of it would probably be part of the group, one of the groups around the globe that would be invited in. If there was some sort of a prove it moment, Natalie or somebody's group would be called in to be one of the groups to evaluate.
Well, this sounds like a movie scenario. This is not the way science works.
It does.
Right. The idea that suddenly this organization is usually the government, because people figure the government's capable of anything and keeps secrets. This is, by the way, a particularly American point of view. I've lived in Europe for quite a long time, and the Europeans don't have scenarios like that because they know that their government works differently than people assume the U.S. government works. But again, it's like the structure of the atom. The government's going to keep that secret and might reveal it to you, and so I mean, to begin with, it's not knowledge that comes from the government, but secondly, it's a science question, and that means it's published in refereed journals. Everybody has access to it. The idea that there's some sort of secrecy that's keeping the existence of extraterrestrials from the public is, that's a nice storyline, but it's just not reality.
Does a little part of you, the kid side, hold out a little bit of hope that there's a possibility somebody puts up the flare and then everyone's got to examine it and do the scientific testing and everything else, but you're always hopeful that at least we get the signal or the this or the that, and there's a possibility of that big discovery. You're certainly hopeful for it, right?
Well, of course. I mean, that's the whole name of the game. But we have a hypothesis that we're not alone in the cosmos, and you try and do an experiment that could maybe prove that's true. There's no way to prove it's not true, unfortunately. All you can do is hope to prove that it is true. And it's not just one group, and it's just not one country. Again, this is science, right? It's not science fiction.
Okay. And if we look at SpaceX, I mean, there was a certain point where we only thought rockets could go up, and the old movies from the 50s would show them actually coming down and landing with a little, the four arms coming out. I think Forbidden Planet showed that as well. And look, here we are today. So we never know where things go and how things unfold in the decades ahead or the years ahead. Who knows? Maybe we're having this conversation 2 years from now with a whole different set of facts. You never know.
Well, the technology will certainly change. I don't think that the science will change very much.
Hmm. Well, Seth Shostak, thank you very much for coming on Angels, Positivity, and Love. It's been a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Michael.